Joseph Stiglitz is widely considered to be one of the most influential economists alive today. In the 1990s, he served as chairman of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors and later as chief economist for the World Bank. The New York Times has called him perhaps the most prominent theorist of his generation. During his career, he has pioneered the theory of asymmetrical information. We'll explain that to you. It argues that there is an inherent inequity between buyers and sellers' access to information in many transactions. The theory has been applied to such diverse areas as used cars, health insurance, and college admissions. In October of this year, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics for his work in this area. He is currently a professor at Columbia University. I'm pleased to welcome him back to this program. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And congratulations.
Thank you.
I mean, this is, you now know that the first line of your obituary,
I know.
Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel winner in economics, died today. I mean, that's what it's going to say, unless you have some other great gift for us that will happen between now and hopefully the long postponed time of your own death. Having said all of that, explain this to me, how you came to this theory that the Nobel Committee thought was so significant.
Well, for 200 years of modern economics, it was always assumed that information was perfect. Right. And not that people really believed that it was perfect, but they didn't know how to incorporate imperfect information into the theories. And the hope was that the world with imperfect information would be very much like a world with perfect information. Right. But you know, in our everyday life, we're always struggling with the imperfections of information, and we know that they're very important. They consume us. You know, when you hire somebody, you worry about how good they're going to be. When you buy a car, you start worrying about, is the guy trying to sell you a lemon?
But let me stop you there, because the world of imperfect information, if you had perfect information, the buyer would know everything about the car that the seller does.
Exactly.
But in the world that we live in, the buyer knows more about the car. The seller knows more than the buyer does. So there's imperfect information.
And there's asymmetric. And that's all that the word asymmetric means, that somebody knows more than the other.
And in health insurance, if I'm the one asking for the insurance, I know more than the insurance company because I know more about my health.
That's right. You know whether you smoke or drink too much or
right.
all the other attributes that make you a bad risk.
So you came to this conclusion that said, with imperfect information, what?
Well, that it makes a very big deal of difference. That to give you what we do conveys information from one side of the market to the other,
right.
And that because I know that and you know that, it affects our behavior.
Right.
So, for instance, you may want to go to school longer, not just because you want to get more education, as valuable as that may be, but also you want to signal to your employer
right.
that you are more able and that you can get through those hurdles that are required, and so that you're conveying information. When the buyer of a used car knows that if he offers too low of a price, only guys who have cars that have lots of problems are going to be willing to sell it. So he starts to infer, if I offer too low of a price, I'm going to get a lousy car.
So he acts on imperfect information.
Exactly. And so one of the important applications of this is that, for instance, you may want to pay a worker more than the minimum amount that you need to get a worker, because if you pay a worker too little, you get a lower quality worker, he won't work as hard. Yeah. In the older theory, with perfect information, you never have to worry about incentives, you never have to worry about who you're hiring, because you know everything.
Yeah.
Now, to a lot of people, that sounds obvious. How did you get a Nobel Prize for that?
Exactly.
They say. And the answer is, first of all, to change the way people think, and they thought about models, economics, as if there were perfect information in a particular way for 200 years, to change that is a lot of work. And secondly, to really convince people of how important this was, one had to construct simple mathematical models. And it's not as easy as it might seem, because when I know that you know that when I'm taking a certain action, it's conveying information.
Right.
But now you know that, and that
affects what you convey.
Exactly. And so you have to think simultaneously about what inferences you're making from what I do and what I do, and that all has to be done at the same time. And that's not so easy.
Now, what this says in the great world of economists is that along came people from Chicago like Milton Friedman and others, and at the Hoover Institution out there, who said markets will always perform what, perfectly or
efficiently? Efficiently, that's right.
And go ahead.
And one of the important results of this is, as I put it, the invisible hand is invisible partly because it's not there. And yes. So the fact is that markets often are inefficient, and there's an important role for government. So this really provides part of the intellectual rationale for why there are certain things that government really ought to be doing. Markets fail. Markets don't, by themselves, don't work.
Okay, the first thing that people are watching you are going to say, doesn't he believe in markets? Doesn't he have faith in markets?
Yes, I believe in markets. I think markets are at the center of our economy. But markets by themselves often run into problems. Think about the S&L debacle that we had a little over a decade ago. Unregulated markets, banking system, made loans that were excessively risky. There was looting, and in fact, they made loans to their friends. And the consequence, American taxpayers had to bail them out.
For a greater good.
And if you had recognized beforehand you needed regulation to prevent this, we would have avoided that problem.
So the market had been fixed beforehand. If the market had been regulated beforehand, your argument goes, you wouldn't have had this problem of these excessive loans.
That's right. It was because of the deregulation that occurred during the Reagan era that we had the S&L debacle. And that's an experience that countries have had around the world. It's just not an American experience. It's really a universal experience.
So you would think then that you would support bailouts around the globe.
No, what you're...
I know where I'm going. All right. You would think you'd support the bailouts, but you don't, because what happens when the IMF and the World Bank want to provide funds, you think that they, in order to give the funds, set up too strict conditions, and you said, I'm out of here.
Yeah, it's more than that. There are, quite often when they give the funds, they put on all kinds of conditions that interfere with their democracies, that take away their right to make their own economic decisions, even political decisions. But there's more to that. Typically, the bailouts, the money from the bailouts goes to keep exchange rates at levels that are unsustainable. And when they're at that higher level, what happens is that people in the country use that to take money out. The rich people get their money out, leaving the country more indebted, but nothing positive comes out of that.
For the mass of the people.
For the mass of the people. Like in Russia, it's an extreme case of this, where the IMF lent over $5 billion in July of '98. The next day, that amount wound up in Cyprus and Swiss bank accounts. The people in Russia now have to pay the IMF back.
Yeah.
But what did the Russian people get? They got the exchange rate kept at too high of a level for an extra few weeks, which squashed their economy because they couldn't sell their goods and let imports come in more cheaply. Finally, when the money ran out in August, the exchange rate fell, and then they started to grow again.
When you made this discovery, in what year? When did you write your model down, your theory down?
The work began around 1969.
20 years ago.
30 years
30
ago.
Years ago.
32 years ago. Actually, when I was in Kenya. Then much of the key work was done over the next 5-6 years, but it's been going on since then.
I've always wondered, why is the Nobel Committee so long in recognizing what obviously was a good idea?
That's a good question, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. This was a very revolutionary idea, yeah. and some of the consequences are very revolutionary.
Yeah.
And you know, Adam Smith's invisible hand is one of the most widely, strongly held beliefs among people who want to have a minimal role for government.
So you were challenging the orthodoxy of the of belief in markets.
Exactly, and doing it in a way that was totally within the economic system. You know, in the sense, I took exactly their models,
yeah.
and changed only one assumption. I said
imperfect knowledge.
Imperfect knowledge. And you said, you know, I said there are other assumptions I disagree with, but I'm going to play your game. I'm going to take all of your assumptions, but I'm going to change only one that you have to agree I'm right. I mean, you can't, you know, this asymmetry of information, you have to agree that that's there. And let's see what happens. And when you started looking at what happened, the results were so dramatic that it was a change in the paradigm of economics.
Yeah, people started making decisions based on the imperfectibility of the absence of perfect knowledge. They made decisions based on that.
All the time.
Right. If you assume that markets don't perform perfectly all the time because knowledge is not perfect, or it is not symmetrical, it is asymmetrical, what do you do to markets to make them, help them, stimulate them to perform better?
Well, the first implication is to realize that when markets are imperfect, they behave differently.
Right.
So you can't pretend that markets are perfect when they're not. So the first thing is you realize that you need a role for regulation, for instance, in the financial markets. Right. Financial markets are concerned with gathering information, but they also need to be overseen. So that's the first thing you do. You recognize that there are a variety of ways that we can make markets more open, more transparent. For instance, one of the important roles of the Securities and Exchange Commission are the disclosure requirements. And one of the big issues that has been recently debated are the fair disclosure regulations, the FD regulations, which say that we shouldn't be, the company shouldn't be creating asymmetric information, which many of them are doing, because they're disclosing some information to some analysts, but not disclosing that information to others. So they're exacerbating the information asymmetries.
And disclosing everything is the idea of transparency.
Exactly.
All right. Let's take today's economy, not the markets plus, today's economy. The President and the administration and the Secretary of the Treasury and Mr. Lindsay all believe that the best way to grow the economy is a tax cut. Tax cuts influence markets?
Yes, but the real question is that the most effective way of stimulating the economy? Let me give you an example. And the issue is partly who gets the tax cuts as well as the magnitude. One of the things is it's not just the amount of money. If you spend money badly, you're not going to get anything from it. So, for instance, in the administration tax cut proposal, it's not, well, for the so-called stimulus.
Right.
A family of four, $50,000 income, the kind of families that firefighters in New York City, over the next 4 years, under the administration's proposal, you know how much they're going to get?
No.
Zero.
Zero?
Yeah, zero. But what I call a typical family of four making $5 million a year.
How much will they get?
Over 4 years?
Yeah.
$500,000.
Now, why is that?
That's the administration's tax cut.
That's the way it's written.
That's the way it's written. Now, to me, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any, it's not fair, but it doesn't make any sense as a stimulus package. You give a low-income person, somebody that's been thrown out of unemployment, who's seen their income fall by 75%. You know, our unemployment insurance system.
Let me anticipate you. If you give them $1, they'll spend the dollar.
Exactly.
Whereas if you give somebody that's rich $1, they're not going to spend it. They're just going to
they'll save a lot of it. They may spend a lot, taking vacations in Europe or whatever. But it's not going to.
But the poor will spend it because they have to spend it to stay above water.
Exactly, especially the poor who've been thrown out of jobs. And what's wonderful, what's good about, from a stimulus design point of view, of unemployment insurance, is that when you provide more money to the unemployed, if the economy does well and the unemployment goes down, we don't have to spend much money. If the recession turns out deeper and longer than people expect, then automatically you put more stimulus into the economy. So it has what I call flexibility. It adjusts to the situation of the economy and has the money going when you need it. Most of the stuff in the administration's tax cut are going to go out, money is going to be spent in years 2, 3, 4, hopefully after the economy recovers. So it's not going to do any good.
But a lot of people recognize that now. They seem to be more and more focused on that and how do you front load it.
That's right. But certainly as originally designed, it was just, and backloading it actually can make things worse, because as you have all this backloaded tax cuts, the government is going to borrow money, surplus is being depleted, we may even go into deficit. That means interest rates, the medium and long-term interest rates, will go up. So while the Fed is lowering the interest rates the short term, it's not having much of an effect on the medium and long term.
Your prognosis for the U.S. economy over the next year?
Not very optimistic. And one of the reasons I'm not very optimistic is
they're not going to do what you just said.
Exactly. and so
let's assume. Because you think the policies the policies to ignite growth in the American economy articulated by the Bush administration, you believe, are simply wrong based on the reasons you said. So therefore, we're not going to get out of this recession, which we're now in, for how long?
Well,
until we change the policies? Or?
Well, no, there are natural restorative forces in the economy.
Yeah.
And,
like what?
Well, for instance, we have excess capacity in IT.
Right.
Eventually, that excess, those old computers are going to get obsolete.
Right. And they need new ones, and they got to go buy new ones and create demand.
That's right. But that can take 9 months, a year, year and a half, 2 years, 3 years. Now, one of the real consequences of delaying recovery is that the downturn in the United States is now spreading to countries around the world. I just came back from a trip to Latin America, and all over that continent, the downturn in the United States is having really serious consequences. It used to be said that when the United States sneezed, Mexico caught a cold.
Right.
Well, now the United States sneezes, all of Latin America catches a cold. And right now, the United States has the flu, if not something worse.
But in fact, not only that, they were real predictions that the European economy would withstand the decline in the American economy and would be immune from it because they had a different set of circumstances at work there. Turned out to be wrong.
Exactly. And Germany right now is in negative growth. This is the first time...
One of the 3 or 4 best economies in the world.
Exactly. And this is the first time in this new era of globalization that all 3 major countries, the United States, Japan, and Germany, are negative, are declining.
Now, what specifically led to your fight with the World Bank, where you were the chief economist?
Well, actually, within the World Bank, there was a great deal of support for the views that I had. It was really more of a fight between the World Bank and the IMF. And it was really over 2 or 3 broad issues. The first was, in the context of the East Asia crisis, I said you ought to have stimulus packages, like we're doing.
Right.
You shouldn't make the economy worse. You should try to stimulate the economy. Just basic. I put myself in the mindset of being chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and I said, what would I do if I was trying to help these countries? And I came to diametrically opposed views.
To the things that the IMF was setting as conditions for its loans.
It wasn't suggesting, it was insisting.
Right.
Secondly, the way the transition from communism to a market economy was managed in Russia and the other Eastern European countries, I thought was just terrible. And the result has been disastrous.
What was terrible about it?
Well, it was again the same use of the market, free market mechanisms, reliance on markets without worrying about the other institutions, for instance, not worrying about the rules of corporate governance. Right. It was also done in the way it was done, shock therapy, very quickly before those institutions could be in place. The disaster, I don't think people fully realize, poverty rates were 2% in 1989, say in Russia. Mm-hmm. By 1998, depending on the numbers, they were 40 or 50% or more.
But the economy of Russia today, perhaps because of oil, is doing much better.
Much better than it was in 98, yeah. But still 30, 40% below what it was before, at the end of communism.
But it's probably better positioned to do better than it was at the end of communism.
No, I think it's actually been undermined.
You really do?
I think there's been a lot of capital, human capital left. You know, a lot of the best people have come to the United States. Enormous amount of capital flight. Capital, you know, while money was put in, one of the conditions the IMF always talked about was capital market liberalization, allowing money to flee.
So you don't think they're on the right track?
I think it's been...
now.
What?
Now.
They're better off, but there are two reasons why they're better off. The price of oil went up, and they devalued.
Right.
Now, the impact of the devaluation is wearing off.
Japan. What's going to happen to Japan?
Japan's in a very difficult position.
Even I knew that.
And the problem is that everybody agrees that it needs to do structural reforms, changes in the banking system. The problem is that typically when you do structural reforms, it pushes the economy down. And secondly, it's very hard to do structural reforms to the banking system when the economy is in recession. You get rid of the bad loans.
Right.
A few months later, more bankruptcies, you have a lot more bad loans. So the structural reforms make the depression worse.
Right.
And the depression makes it impossible to have successful structural reforms. So that two-way interaction means that they missed the opportunity to do those structural reforms when the global economy was in a much better shape. So what they really need to do, and about the only thing they do, and they are moving in this direction, is a lowering of their exchange rate to make them more competitive, that will increase their exports, and that will help stimulate their economy.
Thank you for coming.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Joseph Stiglitz won the Nobel Prize for Economics. He is at Columbia University. He gave up tenure at
Stanford.
At Stanford. Many people don't do that, to come to New York. I assume because they want to live in New York, and because Columbia is a good place, and because some other reasons. But you're here in New York at Columbia doing work. Can you tell me in a half second on what?
Well, the work I do is in three different areas. Some of it's continuing my theoretical work, people like Bruce Greenwald and the economics of information and with implications for monetary theory. Some of it's international, trying to understand the process of globalization, the role of the state in this new globalized era. And some of it is with a new, you might call think tank, something called the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, trying to promote democracy in developing countries, trying to promote the idea that developing countries ought to have a choice. And they ought to have an informed choice, and we ought to be able to help them make their decisions for themselves. So it's trying to disseminate the ideas that are not only I'm working on, but people all over the world. So this is a global effort in which I've involved people in every continent, and in trying to promote the notion. It's called the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, to promote policy dialogue and economic issues around the world.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks.